In the summer of 1858, a young slave boy on a quiet Georgia plantation began noticing things others ignored. A locked shed behind the master's house, strange whispers in the night, and workers who disappeared without explanation. But when the boy finally followed the sound of a voice coming from inside that shed, he uncovered a secret buried beneath the plantation, one so dangerous that the people who discovered it before him were killed to keep it hidden. This is the story of the boy who discovered the plantation's darkest secret. The boy no one noticed. In the summer of 1858, the sun rose slowly over the cotton fields of southern Georgia, painting the sky with a dull orange glow that stretched across miles of land owned by one man. His name was William Carter. To travelers passing along the dusty road near the plantation, Carter's estate looked prosperous. Rows of white cotton stretching endlessly across the fields, a tall wooden house perched on a hill, and barns that stood like silent sentries against the horizon. But beneath the quiet appearance of order and productivity, something darker lived within those fields. Something most people never saw, and something one boy would soon discover. The enslaved workers began their mornings long before the sun fully climbed into the sky. The sound of the iron bell echoed through the slave quarters as early as 4 o'clock, its harsh ringing pulling tired bodies from thin wooden beds. Among them was a boy no older than 14. His name was Samuel. Samuel had been born on the Carter plantation. He had never seen the world beyond its fences, never walked a road that did not lead back to the same cotton fields, and never known a life that did not begin and end under someone else's command. Yet Samuel was different from many of the other children. He was quiet, observant, and he noticed things, small things, things that others, exhausted by years of labor and fear, had long stopped paying attention to. He noticed which doors inside the plantation house were always kept locked. He noticed how certain workers were sometimes taken away late at night and never returned to the fields. And most of all, he noticed the old wooden shed behind the plantation house. It stood alone near the edge of the property, partially hidden by tall pine trees that swayed whenever the wind passed through them. Most of the slaves avoided it, not because they were told to, but because of what they had heard. Some said the shed had once been used as a storage house decades earlier. Others whispered that it had been used for punishment. But the oldest workers, the ones who had lived on the plantation the longest, spoke about it in quieter voices. They said something else had happened there, something no one wanted to remember. Samuel had heard the stories, of course. On warm nights, when the workers gathered near the cabins after a long day in the fields, the elders sometimes told stories about the plantation's past, stories about disappearances, stories about secrets, and stories about people who had asked too many questions. But Samuel was young, and curiosity lives strongest in the young. The shed fascinated him. It was different from the other buildings. While the barns were always busy with movement, and the plantation house buzzed with servants coming and going, the shed remained silent, still, unwatched, or so it seemed. One afternoon, near the end of August in the year 1858, Samuel was sent away from the cotton rows earlier than usual. His job that day was simple: carry fresh water from the well behind the house to the kitchen staff. The walk from the fields to the house was one Samuel had made hundreds of times. But that afternoon, something unusual happened. As he approached the back of the main house, he saw Master Carter standing near the shed. That alone was strange. William Carter rarely visited that part of the property. Yet there he stood, speaking quietly with another man Samuel did not recognize. The stranger wore dark clothing and a wide hat that cast a shadow over his face. His posture was stiff, and his voice, though low, carried a tone that made Samuel slow his steps. Samuel quickly looked down and continued walking, pretending not to notice them. But as he passed by, he heard something that made his heart beat faster. "No one must find out," the stranger said. Carter's reply came almost immediately. "They won't." Samuel kept walking, but his mind stayed behind. No one must find out. Find out what? Later that evening, when the sun dipped below the trees and the workers slowly returned to the cabins, Samuel couldn't stop thinking about what he had heard. Something was hidden inside that shed, something important enough that even Master Carter spoke about it in whispers. For most people on the plantation, that thought would have been enough reason to forget about it, to stay away, to keep quiet. But Samuel was not like most people. That night, as darkness settled across the land and the lanterns inside the plantation house flickered in the distance, Samuel made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find out what was inside the shed. What he did not know was that some secrets were buried for a reason, and the moment someone began digging for the truth sometimes buried them back. The shed behind the house. Night arrived slowly over the Carter plantation. By the time darkness settled across the fields, the air had grown quiet except for the distant chirping of insects and the soft rustling of wind through the tall pine trees. Inside the slave cabins, most of the workers had already collapsed onto their beds. The day's labor had drained every ounce of strength from their bodies, and sleep came quickly to those who had no choice but to rise again before dawn. But Samuel was still awake. He lay on his thin mattress, staring up at the wooden ceiling, listening to the slow breathing of the other boys who slept in the same cabin. His mind would not rest. The conversation he had overheard earlier that day replayed again and again in his thoughts. No one must find out. The stranger's voice had carried something cold within it, something dangerous. Samuel turned his head toward the small window beside his bed. Through the cracks in the wood, he could see the faint glow of moonlight stretching across the yard outside. The plantation house stood silent in the distance. Most of the lights had been extinguished. Only one window still glowed faintly on the upper floor. Samuel slowly sat up. He waited. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, when the night had grown deep enough that even the overseer's patrol footsteps had disappeared, Samuel quietly slipped off his bed. He moved carefully across the wooden floor, trying not to make the boards creak. One of the older boys stirred in his sleep. Samuel froze. The boy rolled over and settled again. Samuel exhaled slowly. Then he reached the cabin door and stepped outside. The night air felt cool against his skin. For a moment, he simply stood there, listening. No voices, no footsteps. Only the distant hum of insects and the gentle movement of trees. The shed stood behind the plantation house, hidden near the tree line where shadows gathered thickest. From the cabins, the walk would take several minutes. Samuel knew the risk. If he were caught wandering at night, punishment would come swiftly. But curiosity pushed him forward. Slowly, he began walking. The ground beneath his feet was soft with dust and dry leaves. Each step felt louder than it probably was, and Samuel found himself pausing often, glancing around the dark yard to make sure no one had noticed him. As he approached the plantation house, its towering shape seemed even larger in the moonlight. The windows were dark now. The lantern that had burned upstairs earlier had been extinguished. Samuel moved along the side of the house, keeping close to the wall. Then he reached the backyard. And there it was, the shed. Up close, it looked older than Samuel had imagined. Its wooden boards had turned gray from years of weather and neglect. The roof sagged slightly, and patches of moss clung to the corners where rainwater collected. But what caught Samuel's attention most was the door. It was thicker than the doors used on the barns, and it was secured with a heavy iron lock. Samuel stepped closer. He glanced back toward the house, still silent, still dark. The boy knelt near the door and studied the ground. The dirt around the shed looked disturbed, as if someone had walked there recently. Samuel frowned. This place was supposed to be abandoned, yet the soil showed fresh footprints. Carefully, Samuel reached out and touched the door. The wood felt cold beneath his fingers. For a moment he hesitated. Every story he had heard about the shed whispered inside his mind, but curiosity was stronger. Samuel slowly leaned closer to the door and pressed his ear against it. At first, he heard nothing, only silence. Then, a faint sound. Samuel pulled back slightly, unsure if he had imagined it. He leaned in again. There it was, a soft noise. It was so quiet that it almost blended into the night. It sounded like movement. Samuel's heart began to pound. Someone was inside. He stepped away from the door, and his mind racing. Who would be inside an abandoned shed in the middle of the night? Before Samuel could think further, another sound came from inside. This one clearer. A slow, dragging noise, followed by something else. A voice, weak, barely louder than a whisper. Samuel's blood turned cold. The voice sounded like it was calling for help. The boy stared at the locked door. His breathing quickened. The stories had said the shed held dark secrets. But Samuel had never imagined something like this. Someone was trapped inside, and whoever had locked that door clearly did not want them to escape. Samuel glanced back toward the plantation house. Still no movement, still no light. Then he looked again at the heavy iron lock hanging from the door. For the first time that night, fear began to replace curiosity. Samuel realized something terrifying. If someone had locked a person inside that shed, and if the master himself had been standing here earlier that day, then whatever was happening inside that building was something the plantation was trying very hard to hide. Samuel took a slow step backward, then another. His instincts told him he should leave. Go back to the cabin. Forget what he had heard. Forget what he had seen. But the faint voice inside the shed came again. Help! Samuel froze. In that moment, the boy understood something that would change his life forever. The secret of the shed was real, and now that he had heard it, he had become part of it. What Samuel did next would determine whether the truth remained buried or whether it would drag him down with it. The voice in the darkness. Samuel stood frozen in the shadows behind the plantation house. The faint voice from inside the shed had gone silent again. For several long moments, the night returned to its usual stillness. The insects hummed in the distance, and the pine trees whispered softly as the wind passed through them. But Samuel knew what he had heard. Someone had spoken. Someone inside that locked shed. He swallowed hard and took another cautious step toward the door. The iron lock hung heavily from the metal latch, dull in the pale moonlight. It was thick and solid, far too strong for a boy his size to break. Samuel placed his hand against the wooden door again, cold, rough, and silent. He leaned closer. "Hello?" he whispered. The word barely left his lips before he regretted it. What if someone inside the plantation house heard him? What if the overseer was walking the grounds? Samuel quickly looked back toward the dark silhouette of the main house. Nothing moved. Samuel pressed his ear closer. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. The person inside coughed softly. "Please, water." Samuel's mind raced. Who could be locked inside this shed? None of the workers had mentioned anyone missing from the fields, but the voice sounded like a man, an adult. Samuel glanced again toward the plantation house. If the master knew someone was locked inside here, then helping that person could bring terrible consequences, yet leaving them there felt impossible. Samuel stepped back and looked around the yard. His eyes fell on a small wooden barrel sitting near the back steps of the house. It held water used by the kitchen servants during the day. Samuel moved quickly but carefully. He dipped a small metal cup into the barrel, filling it halfway. Then he hurried back to the shed. The problem became clear immediately. The door was locked. There was no opening large enough to pass the cup through. Samuel crouched near the bottom of the door and examined the wooden boards. One of them had a narrow crack running along its edge, just wide enough. Slowly, Samuel tilted the cup and allowed a thin stream of water to trickle through the opening. At first, nothing happened. Then he heard movement inside. The person inside the shed shifted closer. Samuel heard the desperate sound of someone trying to catch the small drops of water as they passed through the crack. It was not much, but it was something. Samuel emptied the cup slowly. When the last drop had fallen, the voice inside spoke again. "Thank you." Samuel felt a strange heaviness in his chest. "Why are you in there?" he asked. For a long moment, the person inside did not answer. Then the voice returned, weaker than before. "I heard something." Samuel frowned. "What do you mean?" Another cough came from the darkness. "They buried it." Samuel's breath caught. "Buried what?" Before Samuel could ask another question, a sudden sound cut through the night. Footsteps. Samuel spun around. Someone was approaching from the direction of the plantation house. Lantern light flickered against the side of the building. Samuel's heart leapt into his throat. If he was caught here, the consequences would be severe. Without thinking, Samuel dropped the empty cup and slipped behind the pine trees nearby. From his hiding place, he watched as the figure approached the shed. It was the overseer. The tall man carried a lantern in one hand and a thick wooden stick in the other. He stopped in front of the shed door. For a moment, he simply stood there, listening. Then he spoke through the door. "Still breathing in there?" The weak voice inside the shed did not answer. The overseer chuckled coldly. "That's fine. Won't be much longer now." Samuel's blood ran cold. The overseer leaned closer to the door. "You should have kept your mouth shut." He rattled the iron lock once, making sure it was secure. Then he turned and walked back toward the plantation house, the lantern light slowly fading into the darkness. Samuel remained hidden behind the trees long after the overseer had disappeared. His mind struggled to understand what he had just heard. Someone inside the shed had discovered something buried, and that discovery had cost them their freedom, maybe even their life. Samuel looked back at the shed. The building seemed darker now, more dangerous. And suddenly, Samuel realized something terrifying. If the overseer ever discovered that Samuel had been here tonight, then Samuel might become the next person locked inside that shed. Yet the words the man had spoken still echoed in Samuel's mind. They buried it. Samuel didn't know what it was, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever secret lay hidden on the Carter plantation, people were willing to kill to keep it buried. What was buried? Samuel did not return to the cabin immediately. Even after the overseer's lantern had disappeared into the darkness, the boy remained hidden among the pine trees behind the plantation house. The night had grown colder, but Samuel barely noticed. His thoughts were fixed on the words he had just heard. They buried it. The weak man inside the shed had said it, and the overseer had confirmed it without realizing Samuel was listening. Something had been buried on the Carter plantation. Something important enough that a man was locked away to die for discovering it. Samuel slowly stepped out from behind the trees. The shed loomed before him again, silent and unmoving. For a moment he considered returning to the door. Perhaps the man inside could tell him more, but the overseer might come back. And if Samuel were caught here again, there would be no explanation that could save him. Reluctantly, Samuel turned and made his way back across the yard toward the slave cabins. The plantation slept peacefully around him. The big house stood dark and quiet. The barns were still, and the cotton fields stretched endlessly under the moonlight. Yet Samuel felt as if he were walking through a place that had suddenly become unfamiliar, like a house whose walls were hiding something terrible. When he finally reached the cabin, Samuel slipped quietly inside. The other boys still slept. Their breathing filled the room with a slow rhythm of exhaustion. Samuel returned to his bed but did not lie down immediately. Instead, he sat at the edge of the mattress, staring at the floor. Who was the man in the shed? And what had he discovered? Samuel lay down eventually, but sleep did not come easily. The night felt longer than usual. Every creak of the wooden cabin made Samuel open his eyes again. Every whisper of wind outside the window made his heart beat faster. When the iron bell finally rang before dawn, Samuel felt as if he had not slept at all. The workers gathered outside the cabins, forming small groups before being sent to their assigned tasks for the day. Samuel joined the others heading toward the cotton fields. But today his attention wandered. He found himself studying the land around the plantation in a way he never had before. The fields, the barns, the fences, the tree line beyond the property. If something had been buried, where would they hide it? Plantations were large places. There were countless spots where something could disappear beneath the soil without anyone noticing. Yet the man in the shed had said something else. I heard something. Samuel remembered those words clearly. Heard something. That meant whatever had been buried was not just hidden. It had been hidden somewhere close enough for someone to hear. Samuel worked quietly throughout the morning, but his eyes kept drifting toward the main house, toward the place where the shed waited behind it, toward the ground around it. Then something caught his attention. Near the edge of the field, not far from the plantation house, stood an older man named Isaiah. Isaiah was one of the oldest enslaved workers on the plantation. His back was bent from years of labor, and his hair had turned almost completely gray. But Isaiah was known for something else. He remembered things. Stories from before Samuel had been born. Stories from before many of the younger workers had even arrived on the plantation. Samuel watched him for a moment. If anyone knew the secrets of this place, it might be Isaiah. When the overseer turned his back to shout orders at another group of workers, Samuel slowly moved closer to the old man. Isaiah was pulling weeds from the edge of a cotton row when Samuel reached him. The boy worked beside him for several minutes before speaking. "You ever heard anything about the shed behind the house?" Samuel asked quietly. Isaiah did not answer immediately. His hands continued pulling weeds from the soil. Then he glanced briefly towards the plantation house. "Young ones should stay away from that place," the old man said. Samuel lowered his voice further. "Someone's inside it." Isaiah's hands froze, just for a moment. Then he slowly continued working again. "Best forget what you think you heard," he murmured. "But I heard him," Samuel insisted softly. "He asked for water." Isaiah shook his head slowly. "That place been holding secrets longer than you've been alive." Samuel leaned closer. "What secrets?" Isaiah looked around carefully to make sure the overseer was not watching. Then he spoke in a voice barely louder than the wind moving through the cotton plants. Long time ago, before you was born, before many of us came here, something happened on this land. Samuel listened carefully. The master back then, Carter's father, had men digging near the pine trees one night, Isaiah continued. Digging deep. How deep, Samuel asked. Deep enough nobody would ever find what went down there. Samuel's stomach tightened. What was it? Isaiah's eyes moved slowly toward the plantation house, then toward the distant pine trees, then back to Samuel. No one ever told us exactly, the old man said quietly. But folks heard things that night. Samuel waited. Isaiah lowered his voice even more. Screaming. Samuel felt a chill spread through his chest. And the next morning, Isaiah continued, the digging stopped. What happened to the people who was digging? Samuel asked. Isaiah's face darkened. They disappeared. Samuel stared at him. Disappeared? Isaiah nodded slowly. After that night, no one ever spoke about it again. Samuel looked out toward the pine trees beyond the shed. The ground there looked ordinary, just soil and fallen leaves like anywhere else on the plantation. But now Samuel wondered what might lie beneath it. The old man placed a hand briefly on Samuel's shoulder. Boy, Isaiah said softly, some things buried in this world stay buried for a reason. Samuel swallowed. But if someone heard something, Isaiah's expression turned grim, toward the silent shed behind it, and toward the stretch of pine trees, where something had once been buried in the middle of the night. For the first time, Samuel understood just how dangerous the truth might be, because if the stories Isaiah told were real, then the secret hidden beneath the Carter plantation had been waiting there for many years, waiting, silent. And now, somehow, it had begun to make noise again. The pine trees. The rest of the day passed slowly for Samuel. The sun climbed high over the plantation, beating down on the workers as they moved through the endless rows of cotton. Sweat soaked their clothes, and the overseer's voice echoed across the fields whenever someone slowed their pace. But Samuel's thoughts were far away from the work in front of him. They were fixed on the pine trees, on the story Isaiah had told, and on the terrible possibility that something had been buried there many years ago. Every time Samuel looked toward the plantation house, he could see the dark line of trees, something that was now making noise beneath the ground. Standing behind it like silent watchers, the shed was hidden somewhere among them. Then whoever heard it made a mistake. Samuel looked again toward the plantation house. And beneath those trees, according to Isaiah, men had once dug deep into the earth in the middle of the night. Samuel tried to imagine it, lanterns glowing in the darkness, shovels cutting into the soil, voices whispering in fear, and somewhere beneath that ground, screaming. The thought made his stomach tighten. When the sun finally began to lower in the sky and the day's work ended, the workers slowly made their way back toward the cabins. Samuel walked among them, but he kept glancing toward the plantation house. He knew what he wanted to do, but the risk was greater now. The overseer had already been near the shed the previous night. If Samuel was caught wandering again, punishment would not be small. Still, the mystery pulled at him like a rope. The voice in the shed, the buried secret, and the old man's warning. Some things buried in this world stay buried for a reason. That night, Samuel waited longer than he had the night before. He lay on his bed listening as the sounds of the plantation slowly faded. The kitchen fires died down. The overseer's footsteps stopped, and the great house fell silent. Only when the moon had climbed high into the sky did Samuel rise from his bed again. He moved carefully through the cabin and stepped outside. The night felt heavier than before. Clouds drifted across the sky, covering the moon from time to time and casting long shadows across the ground. Samuel crossed the yard quietly, keeping close to the darker areas where the buildings blocked the light. He did not stop at the shed this time. Instead, he continued walking past it, toward the pine trees. The forested edge of the plantation looked different at night. The tall trees swayed slowly, their branches creaking softly as they moved. The ground beneath them was covered with dry needles and fallen leaves. Samuel stepped carefully as he entered the shadows. For a moment he stood still and listened. Nothing, only the wind, and the faint rustle of leaves moving against each other. Samuel moved deeper among the trees. Isaiah had said the digging happened somewhere near here, but the plantation covered many acres. The ground stretched endlessly in every direction. How could he possibly find the exact place? Samuel walked slowly, scanning the soil beneath the trees. Most of the ground looked untouched, natural. But after several minutes, something caught his attention. A patch of earth that looked slightly different from the rest. Samuel knelt beside it. The soil here seemed looser, less packed down than the ground around it, as if it had once been disturbed. He ran his fingers across the dirt. The surface was uneven, not freshly dug, but not completely settled either. Samuel's heart began beating faster. He brushed aside some of the dry leaves covering the spot. Then he froze. Something white was sticking out of the soil. At first, Samuel thought it might be a rock, but when he cleared away more dirt, the shape became clearer. Long, curved, smooth. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. It was not a rock. It was bone. Someone was banging against the shed door. Samuel stood slowly, his eyes moving between the skeleton beneath the ground and the dark shape of the shed in the distance. The man inside was still alive, still trapped. And now Samuel understood something he hadn't realized before. The voice in the shed had not just heard something buried beneath the plantation. He had discovered it. Samuel looked again at the bones beneath the pine trees, then toward the shed, and a terrible thought formed in his mind. If the master knew the truth had been uncovered, then the man inside the shed would never be allowed to leave it alive, and anyone else who discovered the same secret might end up buried beside the bones beneath the trees. The man in the shed. Samuel did not sleep that night. After discovering the bones beneath the pine trees, the world around him no longer felt the same. The plantation that had once seemed familiar now felt like a place filled with ghosts. Ghosts buried beneath the soil. Ghosts no one was supposed to remember. Samuel returned to the cabin shortly before dawn, his hands still trembling from what he had uncovered. He washed the dirt from his fingers in a small bucket beside the door, but the feeling of the bone beneath the soil would not leave his mind. Someone had been buried there. Not just someone, several people. The fragments of skeleton he had seen suggested more than one body lay beneath the earth, and the man locked inside the shed had somehow discovered it. The iron bell rang before sunrise, calling the workers back to the fields. Samuel moved through the morning like someone walking through a dream. The cotton rows stretched endlessly before him, but his thoughts remained behind the plantation house, behind the shed, behind the pine trees. Every sound around him seemed louder than usual. Every movement of the overseer made Samuel's heart beat faster. If the master or the overseer discovered what Samuel had seen, the consequences would be unthinkable. Yet the voice in the shed haunted him. Water? They buried it? Samuel knew one thing for certain. The man inside that shed was the key to understanding the secret of the plantation. And if Samuel wanted to know the truth, he would have to speak with him again. That night Samuel returned, but this time he carried something different. A small piece of metal he had taken earlier from the barn. It was not a key, but it was thin enough to slide into the narrow space near the iron lock. Samuel had spent the afternoon watching the overseer from a distance. The man always locked the shed carefully. But Samuel had noticed something important. The lock itself was strong, yet the latch it held was older. Rust had begun to weaken the metal. Samuel crouched beside the door in the darkness and examined the latch carefully. The shed was silent tonight. No banging, no knocking. Samuel whispered softly, "Are you still there?" For several seconds there was no answer. Samuel feared the worst. Then a faint voice came from inside. "Yes." Samuel exhaled slowly. The man was still alive. Samuel slid the thin piece of metal into the gap beside the latch and began working it carefully. The rusted metal creaked slightly. Samuel froze, listening. No footsteps. Samuel raised his hand to his nose. The shed was dark, but faint moonlight slipped through the doorway. At first Samuel saw nothing but shadows. Then he noticed movement. A man lay on the ground near the back wall. His clothes were torn and dirty, and his body looked thin from hunger. He shielded his eyes from the sudden light. Samuel stepped inside cautiously. "Can you stand?" Samuel whispered. The man tried to move, but collapsed back against the wall. "I tried," he said weakly. Samuel knelt beside him. "Who are you?" The man looked at Samuel carefully, as if trying to understand why a boy had come to help him. "My name," he said slowly, "is Thomas." Samuel waited. Thomas's voice trembled with exhaustion. "I was hired by the master to repair the well." Samuel frowned. "The well?" Thomas nodded faintly. "While digging, I found something beneath the ground." Samuel felt a chill. "Killed them. And when I found the bones," Thomas continued, "I told the overseer." Samuel already knew what happened next. "They locked you in the shed." Thomas nodded faintly. "They said the secret must stay buried." The man looked at Samuel with tired eyes. "Now you know it too." Samuel felt the weight of those words settle over him. The plantation's secret was no longer just a rumor. It was real, and now two people knew it. Samuel helped Thomas slowly sit upright. "You have to leave," Samuel whispered. "If they find you here—" Thomas gave a weak smile. "They already planned to bury me too." Samuel looked toward the pine trees again, toward the place where the bones lay hidden beneath the soil, and he realized something terrifying. If the master discovered that Thomas had escaped, then the search for the truth would turn into something far more dangerous. Because now there were two witnesses, and on the Carter plantation. Witnesses had a habit of disappearing. But what Samuel and Thomas had just uncovered beneath the plantation was only the beginning. Hidden tunnels, buried bones, and a secret powerful men had killed to protect. And now that the truth had been discovered, the plantation would do anything to make sure it stayed buried. But the most terrifying part of the story had not happened yet. Because deep beneath the Carter plantation, something else was waiting in the darkness. And in the next part, Samuel will discover that the secret they tried to hide was far more dangerous than anyone imagined. If you think this story is disturbing so far, wait until you see what happens next. Make sure you don't miss part 2.